From the nation's capital in Washington, D.C., Cole on Congress. The program discussing national issues that affect Oklahoma. Your host, U.S. Representative Tom Cole.
Thank you for joining me today for another episode of Cole on Congress. Today I'm pleased to welcome my friend Congressman Mike Simpson to the program. Mike serving his 7th term in Congress from Idaho's 2nd Congressional District. We served together on the House Appropriations Subcommittee on Interior and Environment, of which Mike is the chair and obviously the most distinguished and important person. He also serves on the Energy and Water Development Subcommittee, as well as on Labor, Health, and Human Services and Education Subcommittee. And we also serve on the Budget Committee together to defend the appropriations process from our budgeteers. But I always like to start these things with something personal. And as you know, Mike, we've had a running football rivalry, and I just wanted to present you with a football from the 7-time national champions and future national champion, the University of Oklahoma. And I know you're going to treasure that gift.
That will be in my office. That's very valuable, and I appreciate it very much. And in return, I'd like to give you a small helmet from the Boise State Broncos, the winner of the 2005 Fiesta Bowl.
Well, and just in case I lose my humility, this will remind me of what's in front of us. And you know, we may have a little preview here of this year's national championship,
we may have,
which would be good. I do have to tell people here, Mike was incredibly gracious when we were upset in 2005. That last-minute, touchdown drive, and then the overtime drive, I should say, and then the 2-point play at the end, the Statue of Liberty, and it's just unbelievable. But I tried to be nice. I tried to be kind.
You were very nice.
And you guys played a great game. You deserved to win. And about a year later, I run into Mike on the floor of the House, and he says, you've been such a great sport about all this, Tom, and I've got a little something for you, a little pen. It's a nice little Boise State pen. I punched the thing, and he said, just punch it. Just see it works okay. I punch it, and it plays the last 90 seconds of the game.
Well, you got to remember, when you're from a small state, we have to live our glory moments over and over again. So I know when I was in Oklahoma this last month, we hardly brought up the Boise State-Oklahoma game at all.
Oh, well, let's get serious here for a second, and let's talk about your visit to Oklahoma. And, in your committee, you're as chairman of Interior, I mean, you obviously, most people don't realize 20% of the land mass of the United States is owned by the federal government, an enormous swath of territory, and it has minerals, it has national parks, of course, it has all sorts of things. And part of our jurisdiction also includes Indian reservations and Indian lands, because those are held in trust by the federal government.
Right.
And you've been a real leader in that area. I really, frankly, appreciate all you've done, both when you were ranking member and as chairman, in saying that really the first Americans aren't the last Americans, because we know historically this has been the poorest part of the population, shortest lifespan, least educated, least having economic opportunity. And you've really taken that seriously. I know you represent tribes in your own district as well, so you're coming with a knowledge base. But I'd like your impression of kind of what you saw in Chickasaw and Choctaw territory in Oklahoma, and then maybe we can also talk a little bit about what we saw up in South and North Dakota.
Yeah. It was a very interesting trip for me. I've always felt like it was important for the members of the committee to get out and see the real world. Instead of, we have Indian days here in the legislature where they come in before Congress and testify, and we bring in 60 or 65 tribes and they testify for 5 minutes, and it's nice to hear from them. But it's important for us to get out into Indian country and see what the real conditions are out there, what the problems are, what we can do to try to address those problems. And I was very pleased that you invited me to visit Oklahoma and the Choctaw and Chickasaw nations down there. And then, as you said, we went to South Dakota and North Dakota and visited the tribes in that region. We plan on doing several more of these trips out to Indian country across the United States. The one thing you learn is, and the one thing that I think was important for me to learn, is that every tribe is different. It depends on their circumstances. It depends on how they interact with their state government. And if you look at the role that gaming has played for tribes, a lot of people, they're opposed to Indian gaming and that kind of stuff. But the way they're using their resources to help build their infrastructure, whether it's their healthcare infrastructure, whether it's their judicial infrastructure or other types of things, that's the seed money that allows them to do a lot of these things, plus the industries that they are also using to employ their people. If we go to the Pine Ridge Reservation, where they have like 85% unemployment, they really need some industry of their own to help employ their people and to deliver those services that are important to them, whether it's, as I said, healthcare or the judicial system or other types of things. But it's different from reservation to reservation. And it was very educational for me, and I hope it was for Betty McCollum, who was with us, Congresswoman from Minnesota. And we were very pleased to have Secretary of the BIA, Bureau of Indian Affairs, Larry Echohawk, along on most of the trip with us, and Yvette Rubidoux, the Director of Indian Health Services. So I thought it was an educational trip, and as I said, we plan on doing many more of these.
Well, very
across
rare
the country.
to have, because it's bipartisan and obviously both executive branch and legislative branch, but to have, really the top two people in Indian policy from a Democratic administration.
Yeah.
Traveling with a Republican-led delegation that's jurisdiction. I've never heard of anything quite like that before, and I actually think it says a lot of good things about the tone that you set on our committee and about the receptiveness of the administration in this particular area. We have a lot of other disagreements, but in this area, to try and work together and find common ground.
Well, as you said, this has been a bipartisan effort in trying to address the treaty responsibilities we have to meet, the trust responsibilities we have to meet, and the moral obligation we have to make sure that the first Americans are taken care of. And frankly, for 200 years, they haven't been. Promises have been made that haven't been kept, and we need to do everything we can to make sure that they have the same health care available to them that all Americans do. And we don't spend nearly as much on health care for Indians as we do the rest of the population. When you look at some of the crime on some of these reservations and so forth, they don't have the police officers. We have reservations that are as big as the state of New Jersey that have like 9 police officers on the whole tribe. How can they maintain law and order on the tribe, on the reservation, with these kinds of disparities? So we've been working very hard to try to address that. And Tom, as you know, you've been a leader in this cause in Congress and on the Interior Subcommittee, and your leadership on this has been vital in trying to make sure that we address these needs that we have in this
country. Well, I can talk, but it takes chairman to make things happen, Mr. Chairman, and I appreciate you really have. I'd like to just mention, while we're on this topic, you to describe, because you have a very unique relationship with Secretary Echohawk.
Yeah.
This is very unusual and obviously has made things much easier in terms of working together.
Yeah. I first met Secretary Echohawk when I was elected to the Idaho legislature in 1985. He was then a Democrat legislator from a town just on the other side of the Fort Hall Indian Reservation. I come from a town on the north side of the Fort Hall Indian Reservation, and so we served together in the Idaho legislature, and then he became the Attorney General of Idaho. So I've served with him for a number of years, worked with him on a number of issues, and have a great deal of respect for him and his abilities and his sincere desire to do the right thing. And so that makes it a lot easier for me to be able to call him and talk to him and talk about the needs in Indian country and the appropriation process that we go through. Well,
and you weren't just in the legislature, you were the Speaker of the Idaho legislature, and anybody that's got a legislative background understands what that means, the amount of responsibility and honestly the amount of trust that your peers in the majority place in you, and even that the minority extends to you, because they know institutionally you speak for the whole body. So you worked with him closely in that regard, but it also says a lot about your own legislative skills. I was in the legislature, and I was at the back row of the committee. Nobody ever trusted me with a gavel.
Well, I was surprised when I was elected Speaker, to tell you the truth. It was one of those things that I had never aspired to, never aspired to be a member of Congress. I was a dentist enjoying the real world, and got involved in politics because of my interest in it. And when I served in the Idaho legislature, I thought that's all I'd ever do. And then I found myself as caucus chairman and then assistant majority leader, and the next thing I know, I was Speaker of the House. And it's been quite a journey, frankly.
Amazing. Well, of course, our committee, as important as Indian issues are, and as much as I focus on them, has an enormous range of responsibilities in Committee on Interior, and particularly the Environmental Protection Agency, which I always tell Administrator Jackson in a hopefully polite way. She's a nice person. That she really does represent the most hated agency in my district, and you've been a real leader in both trying to cut back and rationalize, I'd say, in a very responsible way. You might talk a little bit about what we've done in terms of the EPA budget, which is a pretty substantial reduction, and then some of the other things that you're trying to push through and convince the executive branch they need to do.
Well, you know, we've had an effort to reduce the overall budgets here because of the deficit that we face and so forth. In our CR that continued this year's funding, there was, I think, a 17% reduction in the EPA budget, and then in the budget we're looking at this year, there's about an 18% reduction, which is pretty substantial. But if you look at the amount of money that was put into the EPA in the stimulus bill that was passed, the $1 trillion stimulus bill, they had an awful lot of money put in there, so I felt that they could withhold or withstand some of the cuts that had to go in. When you look at their budget, much of it is for state and tribal assistance grants to help build water systems and sewer systems and those types of things. And those things we have a backlog on that we really have to address, but the way we fund it doesn't fully address it. We've actually cut funding in that program. We need to find a better way to fund it. What concerns me about the EPA is all the rules and regulations that they are putting out and the impact it is having on job creation in this country. I've talked with industries from around the country that have come in and talked to me about the impact of this rule or that rule and what it's going to do. And so we've got a lot of what they call legislative riders. They're actually funding limitations where they can't use the funds to enact this rule or something like that. We've got a lot of those in our bill. In fact, we put a number of them in the bill, and then when we brought the bill to the fore, members proposed a whole lot more. So there's a ton of those legislative initiatives in this bill, which I think is sending a message to the administration that they need to back off some of these new rules that I think go beyond legislative authority or legislative intent, and that Congress needs to have a say in whether we're going to regulate greenhouse gases or whether we want a utility MAC rule that will potentially close down a sixth of all coal-fired power plants in this country. Those types of things. And that's having a huge impact on job creation in this country because employers are looking at this going, if I hire a new employer, if I do X, Y, or Z to my facility, I have no idea whether I'm going to be able to afford that. I have no idea what the costs are going to be. I have no idea what the health care costs of an employee that I'm going to hire are going to be. And that's why you see businesses sitting on the back bench waiting for some stability and certainty.
Another area that you've focused a lot of attention on our committee is actually the number of times we hear the phrase climate change and the variety of things that we're doing. And I'd like you to talk a little bit about that in terms of cost, efficiency, and where we ought to head on what's both a contentious but an important issue.
Well, you know, several years ago after 9/11 occurred, everybody that came into our offices, I'm sure it happened in your office also, when they wanted funding for some program, they always had to tie the phrase Homeland Security into it, so that we had to do this because of Homeland Security, et cetera, et cetera. So if you wanted to grow corn in Iowa, we were doing it because of Homeland Security. That's how agencies get funding. Now the key phrase is climate change. We need to do this because of climate change and stuff. And while nobody, I shouldn't say nobody, but most people agree that there is change going on in the climate, the debate is about how much of it is caused by mankind, and even if we did everything that those people want us to do, would it make a change in the climate? Unfortunately, the answer for the last 4 years has been just to throw more money at it. There is no coordination between agencies. Nobody can actually tell you how much money the federal government is spending on studying climate change and implementing various rules and all of this kind of stuff on climate change. And a lot of that comes in our budget. About $450 million went into various agencies. And it goes to almost every agency because they know that's how they're going to get dollars, is by doing something relative to climate change. So what we've tried to do is bring it back and put it in one line item so that we know what we're spending on climate change. I've thought the best thing to do is to give it to one agency, and then if there's another agency, if the Forest Service wants to do some things relative to climate change, they have to compete with other agencies doing things in that same arena, so that we're not being duplicative, that we're not wasting taxpayer money. And frankly, that's one of the areas that we've cut back in this budget. And it's not because I'm a climate change denier. It's just that we've got to be smarter about how we spend money here.
Well, another area, again, where you've kind of been the voice of reason on the committee, and again, a very contentious area, it's been the Endangered Species Act. And what do we do? As appropriators, we appropriate the money that funds that particular operation. But over the years, you know the numbers better than I do. We've not gotten the kind of results that you want, either from a conservation standpoint or just rational administration of a program.
Right. There's been, I think, since the enactment of the Endangered Species Act, there's been like almost 2,000 species listed, and there's been 21 recovered, I think is the number. It ought to have a better success rate if it's doing its job. The other thing that concerns me is that for over 23 years, the Endangered Species Act's authorization has expired. And the only way it gets reauthorized all the time is because we keep funding an expired program. Everybody agrees, virtually everybody agrees, that some reforms need to be made to the Endangered Species Act. We have differences of opinion about what those reforms are. But the Resources Committee needs to take it up and do the reauthorization, make the changes that we all recognize now will do what we intend for the Endangered Species Act. And the only way to put pressure on them is just not to fund it and continuing it by funding it. So we defunded it. Now an amendment passed to put the money back in because they thought we were going to, they called it the extinction rider that would have made the species go extinct. That's not the intent. The intent is to have an Endangered Species Act that worked. If you remember when it was enacted, it was almost supported universally by Republicans and Democrats. Very few votes against it. In fact, I'm not sure there were any in the Senate. Because everybody had an idea of, yeah, we want to save the American eagle and we want to save grizzly bears and other types of things like that. But unfortunately, in the last several years, 10 years, 20 years, the Endangered Species Act has been used to control land and water rather than save species. And, you know, if you want to get cows off of public lands for grazing, go out there and find an endangered species, or list an endangered species, or put one under study, and you'll get cows off. And that's what some people that don't like public grazing have decided to do. We need to get it back to what it was intended for.
Well, I tell you, I think you've been a real leader, and that is a tough issue. As we all know, we've seen people defeated over trying to deal with that. It takes honestly real legislative courage to walk into the landmine and to tell the authorizing committees, you guys need to get your act together and bring us a reformed bipartisan proposal. We'll work with you.
There are something like 58 programs in the Interior bill where the authorizations have expired. And while we couldn't just defund all of them, the fact is that we're trying to send a message when we defunded the Endangered Species Act. We didn't give any money to list new species. We're trying to send a message to the authorizing committees: get busy and do your work. And hopefully that message is getting through, whether this amendment survived or didn't survive.
Well, it was a great discussion, great effort.
Yes, it was.
You know, as good as you are at this committee, I remember once you told me that if you got your favorite subcommittee on appropriations was actually energy and water because of all the extraordinary things that are done there. You're a very senior member there, and no doubt will be the chairman there at some point. What do you see as the great challenges and issues on that particular committee that really are national in scope?
The toughest thing on the Energy and Water Subcommittee, and I've taken an interest in it because the Idaho National Laboratory, which is the lead nuclear lab in the country, is in my district. Idaho Falls is the main hub of those operations. And but then I've taken an interest in nuclear energy in general across the entire country and the complex that we have. We have to have an all-of-the-above policy in this country. We can't favor one form of energy production over another. I mean, 52% of our energy today is produced by coal. It's going to be 52% in the next 10 years. We have to have clean coal technology and do the things that are necessary to improve that. Oil and natural gas are obviously very important. Are the renewables, the wind, the solar, geothermal, You know, that's about 2% of the production of our total electricity. It's an important 2%, but we're never going to have renewables that replace those traditional forms of energy. About 20% of our energy is produced by, of our electricity is produced by nuclear energy. That's probably going to grow some in the future if we'll get busy. The biggest problem I find within the Department of Energy is that a lot of these programs take 10, 20, 30 years to follow through on. If you're going to build a nuclear power plant, you're probably looking at 20 years to get the permitting and all that kind of stuff done. When you're doing the research and development on how you close the fuel cycle on nuclear energy, that's a long-term prospect. We have, as you know, elections every 4 years for administrations. We have secretaries of energy that generally last 2 or 3 years, undersecretaries sometimes less than that. And every time we have a new administration and a new secretary, it seems like we change directions. For a while, I lived through what was called in the nuclear industry the IFR, Integral Fast Reactor bubble, where that was the next best thing, and we poured millions of dollars into that. And then we went through the GNEP bubble, which we poured money into that, and then the NGNP bubble that we poured money into, and now we're on to small modular reactor bubble. I don't want to be here 5 years from now saying, well, we poured a lot of money into small modular reactors, and now we're on to something else. We need a sustainable program that goes across administrations for these long-term projects like that.
Well, you know, while you and I obviously focus on the day-to-day work we have in our respective subcommittees on appropriations, you know, we're actually involved in a couple of pretty big debates that go beyond the kind of day-to-day work of Congress. You've been a senior member of the Budget Committee for quite a few years, and, which is a chore, you know, and a pretty grim thing. So I'd like to, there's two topics, and do them in order, but I'd like to get your view on the national budget, where we're headed, what the choices and challenges we have as a country are. And then second, particularly, get your thoughts on this latest proposal the President's placed in front of us, the American Jobs Act, because we're going to be talking about that a lot
we are.
the next couple of months.
Well, as you know, from serving on the Budget Committee, it is a tough issue. When the President proposed his budget earlier this year, I asked the OMB director, I said, under this proposal, when does this budget get to balance? Never. That was the answer. It never got to balance under that proposal. How can you be the President and not propose a budget that at some point in the future, you know, 10 years, 20 years, 50 years, I don't care, but it's got to get to budget at some point, and it's got to get to a balanced budget at some point in time. They didn't propose that. We know the problems that this budget deficit, the annual budget deficit, and the debt is causing to our country. And it's our responsibility to get under control. We're doing part of it by reducing spending and being more careful about what we spend, but that can't be all of it. That'll never get us to balance. What we have to do is get the economy growing, and we have to reform the entitlement programs. I also think that we have to reform the regulatory environment that is hampering business. So if we do those three things, reform the entitlement programs. Nobody likes to talk about that because everybody gets an entitlement, or all the senior citizens do, or you hope to at some point in time get your Social Security.
Well, it's getting very. I'm very focused on this.
I'm
now.
getting closer to it. But the problem is if we don't reform Social Security and Medicare, it's not going to be there for the people that are paying into it today. So as a moral obligation, we have the responsibility to change it, to make it sustainable so that it's there for future generations. But that's a tough vote. But we've got to do that. We've got to get our spending under control. We need tax reform so that we start using the tax code to actually raise the necessary revenue to fund the government, and we can debate what that necessary revenue ought to be. But instead, we use the tax code to direct social behavior. If you will invest in wind energy, you'll get a tax break. If you invest in coal, there's a penalty. So we ought to use it to raise the revenue and let business decisions on where people invest and how businesses spend their money be made on what makes economic sense for them. But that means you're going to have to get rid of a lot of the loopholes in the tax code, and as you know, everybody that's got a loophole that they like is going to fight like heck to keep that loophole. So we need to do those things, and I think we can get our economy growing again.
Well, I couldn't agree with you more. I do think it's going to be a generational challenge, and I don't expect one big bill or one big fix.
Yeah.
I think we're going to have to go at this incrementally. I was pretty proud we put a budget on the table. It's controversial. It may not be the only real budget out there was the Ryan budget, which really does cut spending. Really, we all cast tough votes on the entitlement reform issue where Medicare was concerned. And over time, but a long time, actually brings us toward balance.
Yeah.
And it's sad not to have that proposal from our counterparts in the Democratic Party. They need to put something out there, and particularly from the administration.
Yeah.
I mean, that's where the energy has to come from to tackle these problems.
That's right. But, we got the living heck kicked out of us on the Ryan budget over the Medicare proposal. Yeah. And as I told people, listen, I don't know that I agree entirely with the Ryan Medicare proposal here, but I do know we need to reform it, and we need to stop beating each other up on it. And if you've got a better idea, let's hear it. But everybody in Congress, Republican and Democrat alike, realize these entitlements cannot go on the way they are. They are not self-sustaining. I try to tell people, listen, when Social Security started, there were 17 workers for every retiree. The average lifespan was 64 years old. That's a system that'll last forever. Unfortunately, today there are 2.5 workers for every retiree, and the average lifespan is in the 80s. That's a system that just doesn't pencil out anymore. So we got to make some changes.
Yeah,
and we got to have the courage to do it.
I couldn't agree more. American Job Acts. President's called us back in the joint session, put a very aggressive proposal. Has now told us or begun to tell us how he's going to pay for it. What's your view of that?
Unfortunately, I don't think it creates jobs. Now, there are some parts of it that I think we have to do. The extension of the payroll tax cuts that were put in a year ago. While I have some misgivings about that, because if you've got a Social Security system that is going broke and you reduce the revenue to go into it, you're making it go broke quicker. But at this time in our economy, I don't think you want to raise $1,500 in taxes on the average family by reimposing the regular withholding rates. So I think that probably will pass. The other provisions in there I've got some real problems with because I don't think they create jobs. The additional spending, I think the bigger crisis we face is our budget deficit and the long-term debt we have in this country, and we're just adding to it. And if the president can find $500 billion to pay for this program, I would rather use the $500 billion to pay down the debt.
Well, what I hear, and I'm sure you do the same thing, is give us some certainty in business about what our taxes are going to be.
That's right.
Give us some certainty about regulations. Give us the kind of environment in which we're willing to risk capital. Otherwise, we're just going to hold the money. And I don't think you can create a public sector-led recovery in the United States. I think at the end of the day, it's always about incentivizing the private sector.
Yeah.
And that's what tends to pull America out of recessions and depressions.
Yep, that's right. And that's the only thing that gets us to a balanced budget. I had a reporter ask me one day when we were talking about these regulations that were being proposed in the Interior Bill. She said, well, don't you know how many jobs this is going to cost? I said, what do you mean? She says, well, within the people that write the legislation, that write the rules and all this kind of stuff, people that work at the EPA, how many layoffs they're going to have. I said, you got to remember that the purpose of government is not to employ people, it's to do a certain job. We employ people to do that job. If we don't want that job done, we shouldn't be hiring people to do it. And but some people think that the government is the answer, and it's not.
Well, Mike, I just want to conclude. We got a few seconds here by just telling you and I mean this in all sincerity. I don't do this in every show, but it's been a wonderful pleasure to get to serve with you on appropriations, to watch you work as a ranker, to get the opportunity to be on your committee as a chairman. You really are a legislator's legislator. You move product, you care about this stuff. We hold good oversight hearings. You work in a bipartisan fashion. There are more Mike Simpsons in Congress. I can tell you Congress should work a whole lot better than it does.
Well, thank you, Tom.
Yes, thank you.
Pleasure to be on your program, and it was great to visit Oklahoma.
Good. Come back, but you can leave that helmet someplace
We'll
else.
have a national championship game here.
Looking forward to it. Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.